I want to welcome you all to this new session of the program Building Capacities for International Research. Sorry for being late, but we had breakfast and there was another presentation and it took us some extra time. I want to introduce Professor Ara Tahmassian. He's the Chief Research Compliance Officer. He's responsible for the oversight of the development and implementation of policies related to research compliance at Harvard University, and works to manage potential risks at the university by integrating and coordinating the significant compliance requirements set by many institutions. He was previously the Associate Vice President for Research Compliance at Boston University. Dr. Tahmassian holds a Bachelor of Science in Nuclear Engineering, a PH.D. in radiobiology from Queen Mary College, London University, and is a diplomat of the American Board of Sciences in Nuclear Medicine. Ara?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, my apologies for being late. So, what I would like to do is to spend a few minutes as we go through the slides to talk about, I think you guys, most of you are involved and are aware of the subject protection, the ethics committee, and so on. So please let's make this interactive, ask questions, and so on. So I think, if I can figure out how, there you go. So I think, we all know that it's extremely important that that human subjects participate in the research. It's been a sort of cornerstone of our discovery. We can't do it. I mean, if you think about all the discoveries we have, especially in the medicine, biomedical research, and so on, we couldn't do it if we didn't have the actual human subject participation, the patients, and so on. But in sort of the use of human subjects or participation in human subjects in research comes with additional responsibilities that we as scientists, as researchers have towards making sure that we are actually protecting the individuals and individual rights. And as you can see from the next few slides, there have been unfortunate incidents. One of the most famous one in the United States. I think, how many of you know about the Tuskegee syphilis studies? Great. And this was a study in which, sort of actual African American participants. The study was done with the U.S. Actually Public Health Service, that's the government Health and Human Services Division, and it included actually sort of having some of the participants being infected with syphilis and then not being given treatments. And they had no idea what they were being exposed to, nor did they have any idea of, sort of treatment that was being done. And as you can see, it actually came into being when someone actually went to their senator and sort of raised an issue, and it started a national inquiry and a congressional hearing, and at the end of the day, this literally changed the entire kind of approach to human subjects in the United States. So this was a major kind of negative event. I think everyone is familiar with the Nazi experiment and sort of the amount of studies that they did on the prisoners, and sort of use the information as part of the medical research enterprise. And again, if you know, as most of you know, that resulted in kind of the Nuremberg Code, which was after the Nuremberg trials, which sort of essentially set up the ethics principles for using human subjects in research. And essentially, the 10 principles of the code in Nuremberg Code are here. You'll have access to the slides, so I'm not going to read everything in the slides, but I think the most important factor to me are really the first three ones. That there has to be voluntary informed consent, meaning that the subject must be informed and provide consent, and it has to be voluntary. They cannot be forced or coerced into participating. Experiments should be designed to benefit the society. This is the risk-benefit, analysis. And just because you think something makes good, sort of paper for you, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the society or it has a benefit. And at least in the US and EU, many of the IRBs or the ethics committees actually pay a lot of attention to this. And studies will be rejected if the committee doesn't think that there is a benefit, that you have actually sort of managed to outweigh the risks. And then the third one is, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of breath still, walking up, so. And the third one is, in essence, has become one of the major, and today it's controversial, as we will talk about animal research later, is that all human subject experiments must be preceded with animal experiments. And again, the idea is that we should not be testing anything where we have not tested in humans first, because we don't know the effect of it. Thank you. I think you jinxed me. You said that I was not having problem with the altitude. Yeah. So anyway, so after the sort of Nuremberg Code came out in 1964, there was the Declaration of Helsinki, which essentially was from the World Medical Association that adopted the declaration, and it set up the ethical principles for the medical research involving human subjects. And obviously, like any other document, it is not a static document. It keeps changing as the norms and knowledge changes, and as you can see, it's been amended since then, the last time in 2013. One of the important things here is the last bullet point, that now the journal editors actually require you to certify. Reputable journals, I should say, not every journal, but reputable journals, they want you to certify that you had an ethics review. And that, actually some of them ask for a copy. So this is sort of the US equivalent of it, which is known as the Belmont Report. And this, unfortunately, our name is on this list, as you can see, is that we had an anesthesiologist, Henry Pitcher, who put a very nice article together, and in that article he identified 22 ethically questionable medical research studies that were published in very respected medical journals at the time. And he questioned whether these were ethical research or not, or whether that research should have been done or not. So, included obviously the Tuskegee report and so on. And it ended up actually with a commission which became known as the Belmont Report, which has become essentially the cornerstone, the fundamental way that now we in the US look at how to protect human subjects. Belmont Report can be summarized actually in 3 bullet points. Number 1 is respect for persons, meaning that every human subject research that actually the core fundamental is that you respect the participant, the rights of the participant you protect. Beneficence, which means there is a benefit to them. And the last one, which is unique, was actually at the time at least unique to the Belmont Report, is justice. And what justice meant is that the benefits of the study has to be equally shared amongst the community. And it cannot be that you do a study, for example, with a drug, develop a drug in a way that the drug can only be used by people who can afford to pay for it. It has to be for everyone, whether they can or they cannot. So that sort of became a major difference between the Belmont Report and the previous report, that justice became a factor, and what is it for the good of the society. And that's what literally the justice part means. And again, respect for person, the individual should be treated as autonomous human being and not as a means to an end, meaning that they are, even though they are a subject in the study, but they're not an object, they're a human being. And they have the right to say no, they have the right to step out, they have the right to ask questions, and so that's number 1, that each individual is treated as an independent human being, with their rights protected. The second one is diminished autonomy, meaning that there are individuals who cannot act 100% on behalf of themselves. Children, mentally ill participants, and so on. Prisoners, at least in the US, we consider them under this category. And these are called generally vulnerable populations. And what it means is that when you have vulnerable populations, you have to provide them with extra protection, because children can't talk for themselves. So that's part of it. And research must be, on a voluntary basis, and the subjects have the right to withdraw, no negative consequence. This is very important when you are doing clinical trials, that at the middle of the trial, maybe it's a combination of a treatment and a research project. If the subject says, I don't want to participate in this anymore, you cannot have the clinical care be impacted by that. In other words, it cannot be a conditional, that if you want to get this additional care, you have to. It has to be with no actual change, no negative consequences if people try to withdraw from the study. Beneficence, as I said, no harm, maximum benefit versus risk, and that's one of the important roles that the Ethics Committee or the IRB, Institutional Review Board, have to take into consideration, and this is where a lot of studies will be rejected. And this actually is coming more of a surprise to the newcomers to the human subjects experiment field, and that's a lot of the social scientists, economists, sort of people who are not traditionally used to this, and they come in with something that has been traditionally done without the need for human subjects review, but then they're surprised to find out that, if their study doesn't show any benefit, but there are risks associated with what they're trying to do. And the risk might be that, for example, if you are a social scientist who is interested in alcoholism, and you want to find out, sort of what are the categories and so on, this is actually a study I know about, which was rejected. At the end of the day was, well, what is the benefit of the study? So you're asking participants to come, talk to you, give their name, information about themselves. There's a lot of risk, because if that information gets out into the public, they're likely to lose their jobs. There could be some other social kind of negatives. But the study is offering at the end of it, okay, so you are going to publish a paper. But what is the good of the results to the society? So that's the kind of thing that sort of you go back and forth. And if you can't show that the benefits actually outweigh the risks, then the study can't be done. And again, as I said, it has to be for the benefit of everyone and not just one group. In fact, in the US, almost every ethics committee requires that you be very clear to the patient whether he or she will get, or subject who's participating, whether they will get a direct benefit or not. So if you look at most of the consent forms, it says that you will receive no direct benefit, or the likelihood of you receiving a direct benefit from the study is low, but it will benefit, and then they cannot say who, or the society as a whole. Now please ask questions if there are any. Oh yes?
You just mentioned a study where they wanted to study alcohol.
Yeah.
Right? Alcohol consumption. And you said that the risks were too high, but you didn't mention what the benefits were according to the science.
According to thank you.
So it's
yeah.
important to,
Yeah.
in order to understand why those risks were higher.
Yes. Yeah. Basically, in that particular instant, what he was proposing, what his thesis was, or theory was, is that there were certain categories of jobs that are going to have a higher rate of alcoholism. And the answer was this: absolutely. My job is probably one of them, because there's a lot of pressure. But on a serious note, I mean, we said this is not good enough. Can you be a little bit more specific? And his answer was not something that, it was basically that, well, we want to understand what are the job categories. And there was like, so then what? And at the end of the day, as I said, once the committee reviewed this, we just could not understand what benefit is that, other than you understand. And yes, there are certain jobs which are more stressful, and there's likely, it's probably true that some jobs are. But what happens to that information? What benefit does it do? He didn't come back and say that in this case we want to look at, just let me give you a parallel to this study. Another one where a group was very interested in doing a survey of nurses in the hospitals for drug abuse. Because as you probably know, there is a higher level of drug abuse and actually taking patient drugs, narcotics, and using them as a substitute. There have been a lot of studies about this. And what they wanted to understand is sort of to get a better understanding of A, the prevalence, and B, some understanding of why, and is it sort of the longer night shifts, day shifts, what is the stress? Is it people who are working 14 hours that use this? And based on that, they were going to do phase 2 of this study, which was what would be an effective interdiction. How could you sort of prevent that from happening? In that case, again, there are very sort of serious potential risks to the participants on a professional basis if they can find out that somebody is actually stealing the patient drugs. But on the other hand, the benefits that could come out of it is quite significant. So here the two studies, similar kind of thing. One clearly defines what they're trying to achieve. The other one was very unclear. And then justice, we have already talked that the advantage of the therapies derived from publicly funded research are provided to all people. And as I said earlier, this is sort of one of the unique things to the Belmont report that didn't appear in the Nuremberg Code or the Helsinki Declaration. Very quickly, in terms of regulations, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but in the United States, we have what is known as the common rule, which is a uniform set of human subject protection that 15 of the federal agencies that fund research have all agreed to follow. So which is a good thing, because now we have one set of regulations that everyone understands what it is. And the important thing is, if you are receiving federal funding, the expectation is that you will follow the requirements of the National Institutes of Health. How many of you actually are part of an ethics committee here? Perfect. So I don't know if you have, so that one of the requirements of receiving the federal funding, especially from the National Institute of Health, is that you have to have a registered, what they call a federal-wide assurance. You have to register your ethics committee or your IRB. And actually, the Office of Human Research Protection, OHRP, maintains a online database that you can go in and you can select your institution or any institution, and it will do it. We are required that if we're collaborating with someone and the funding that is used for collaboration is federal collaboration, we have to make sure that they have actually an FWA in place. If you don't, then there's a whole set of additional paperwork that we need to make sure that is in place before we can collaborate. So if you haven't registered, it might be worthwhile thinking about registering. It's not a very complicated process, and I think you already have most of the infrastructure to register your IRBs. I'll be happy to talk to you during the break. Yes.
How many boards do you have at your institution?
Sorry?
How many boards do you have?
Three. We have 3 IRBs. One is what we call the university area, which is the Cambridge area. There's one for the School of Public Health, and there's one School of Medicine and Dental School. And there's sort of a variety of reasons why we selected 3, in part because if you look at the university area, we have a lot of social sciences, politics, economics, and so on, psychology, obviously, but we also have a lot of undergraduate research projects which involve the use of human subjects. So that's a little bit specialized. On the other hand, on the medical school and the dental school, they do a lot of, because most of the faculty of medicine also practice in the hospitals and in the affiliated hospitals. So they have clinical activities. So we felt that that specialty needed to be more focused, and public health is more international focused. But we have three, and all three of them are registered. In European Union, the same thing. Again, as you can see, the facilitating research excellence in the 7th framework program, FP7. I mean, Europe has this habit of using a lot of numbers. So one of these days I'll understand what it is. But again, the whole European guidance for the use of human subjects is fundamentally based on the Nuremberg Code. The same thing. It has to be voluntary. It has to be based on consent form and so on. And again, all of these documents are available online, by the way. You can, yes?
I want to take advantage of the question about the IRBs.
Yes.
All the projects, all the research projects have to go through these IRBs, or there is like a fast track for some of the projects that the chair of the department may decide? No.
If you are working under the auspices of the federal funding, IRB is the only entity that has to can make the determination. Yes?
Related to that question, I know we have in Rotterdam a fast track in terms of, for example, I work a lot with cancer registries, which have their own, but many journals and financiers want IRB clearance, and then you don't have to go through the whole process.
Oh no, that's correct.
You can have a fast track in terms of, okay, this one doesn't need ethical approval because it is under this category.
Yeah. So we have actually, that's a very good distinction. So in terms of, can a department chair say, I sign off, go do it? No, it has to go to the IRB. But the IRB itself actually technically has 4 different processes. One is that based on a very quick screening questions, they can determine that it's not human subject research, okay? And they can actually certify it, so when you go to the agency or to go to the publication, you can give it to the agency, or to the journal. And what it means is, for example, if you are going to pick a lot of data, which is the identified data, even if it comes from subjects, and you don't have the key meaning, you cannot go back and re-identify the subjects. The second one is actually exempt, which means that it is exempt from a lot of the requirements. It's a very low risk study, something that you are doing a general survey about people's attitude towards money. I'm just making something up. And all you are collecting is their name, email address, and a few demographics like age and sex, male, female, and nothing really sort of beyond that. So that if that information was lost, the damage to the individual or the potential risk is minimal. In those cases, it's exempt. Actually, an administrator within the IRB office just reviews it. In my institution, typically that's about it. From the time you submit to the time you get approval, typically is 2 to 3 days maximum. So it's really sort of a fast track. Then the second one is the expedited process, the next one. An expedited process means that, again, the administrative staff in the office, the IRB ethics office, the people at the IRB, review and ask questions or clarifications, and then one member of the committee who has the expertise in that field will have also another quick review of that, and then they will make a determination, and then it can be signed off. And if I was to kind of guess at Harvard, I would say probably 80% of on the Cambridge side, which is the main campus, probably 80 to 85%, all of the studies are exempt or expedited. Then 15% or so, roughly, has to go to the full committee. These are the things which are very high risk, or there are questions about the risk-benefit analysis and so on. So yes, I mean, there is a process that it doesn't mean every application goes through the entire committee review.
Do you have documentation of those processes? Because
Yes.
here we exaggerate sometimes a little bit. Really simple things. If students ask their fellow students, medical students, ask their fellow students if they wash their hands in the bathroom, they need to go to the full medical ethics. I mean, so it
No, we have that,
helpful
and
to
we're
have
happy,
this
absolutely,
information.
yeah. Yeah, we have a very detailed, in fact, not only we have the handbook and the process out there, but internally we also have a very detailed processes for the administrators. I would be happy to share that with you, because that's very specific instructions, what we call the efficiency manual. But we don't tell everyone. But this is really our internal operating manual, in which very sort of clearly with examples for the administrators, so they can kind of get a sense of not overflowing. Yeah, that's the last thing you want to do.
For both sides, for the researcher and the
Absolutely. Yeah, but also, you know what? I mean, it's pragmatically or practically. My personal opinion always is that if we don't do things based on the real risk, we lose credibility. Because again, if every time it comes in, and as you said, actually with the students, we have actually created a completely different track, and we have given very specific examples, and we even guide most of the time a few things that if they don't do, then they don't even need to go to the IRB. We have actually Qualtrics. We use a Qualtrics questionnaire that we ask them very quickly to go through the question, and we screen them. So most of our student projects can actually be determined within the first 48 hours. And again, the reason is because most of them are low risk. And what we don't want to do is that the 15 or 20% which are high risk to be lost in all of the other noise signal that is just coming from the low risk. But we're happy to share any of this stuff.
I
Yeah,
want to
sure.
clarify if you just emphasized these procedures for external funding,
Yeah.
or they also apply to internal funding research.
Well, we at Harvard, what we have decided is that all of our human subject protection criteria is independent of source of funding, whether it's funded or not funded. And here is my argument for it, is that I think, let's take that you were doing a study which is funded by NIH, and it went to the IRB, whatever it is, or National Science Foundation, or Gates Foundation, or whatever. And then another one which the department chair decides to fund. And something goes wrong with the second one. How am I going to explain that the two studies, for study one, have provided protection, and for population two, I don't care? I mean, that's sort of the basic. And actually, if you talk to, I don't know exact numbers, but I will guarantee you that 90+% of all the universities in the US apply the same standards, regardless of the source of funding. And again, sort of going back to the EU, just quickly, if you look at it, it's the same thing. Everyone has the right and respect for his or her mental integrity. Everyone has the right to respect for his or her private and family life, home or communications, and then everyone has the right for protection of personal data. This is sort of part of the EU communication. By the way, this is, I think this is very similar to Article 15 of the Colombian Constitution for the protection of the individual rights and your personal property. So, sort of in part, Marcel and I were talking about this yesterday, a lot of the principles that are being used under the EU are actually in the Article 15 of the Constitution of Colombia. So we went and actually checked it. Yeah. So UN, again, United Nations has another set of regulations and requirements. And then there's a long list that I have for other countries. If you are working with any country, I mean, there is a link which is available in the thing. If you go to the Office of Human Subjects Protection, they have an international section, and there is a PDF list that you can download, and it has lists of every country by grouping, for example, Latin America, Asia, and so on. And they have the human subject protection regulations listed for every one of those countries. So you can actually kind of see what the requirements are. Just a few very quick definitions so that you understand when we say it's non-human subject or it's not research. So in the US, there is sort of very specific definition. Research is defined as a systematic study directed towards fuller scientific knowledge or understanding of the subject studied. So it's generalizable knowledge that you're going to put out for the general public. That, to go back to your question, a lot of student projects classroom projects, demonstration projects, are not generalizable. You know, the student might do a project as part of a coursework or as part of a, you know, sort of undergraduate or graduate project, and the maximum presentation they're going to do to a class program or give it to them. So that, in most instances, we say that that's not generalizable knowledge, and that's what the handbook for the students has sort of clarified what to do so that they can do. And then human subject is very important to realize that it's living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, okay, so students are not exempt, is conducting research and obtains data through interventions or interactions. And this is where now, you know, with a lot of social, you know, sort of non-traditional economists, you know, anthropologists and so on are having difficulty in kind of grasping the concept of that this is human subject, because there is an interaction. If you're sitting with someone, talking to someone, getting questions, you know, it's considered as an interaction. And then the other part that I've highlighted is identifiable private information. Okay, so even if you are, you know, you're not interacting directly with the person, you're doing a survey, or you're going to somebody's credit card records, or cell phone records, or health records, and are obtaining identifiable but private information, then it has to be reviewed by the IRB.
Do you have human organs of reading people?
No, actually, it's very interesting. So organs or parts, you know, surgical specimens and so on that come out of the patient or the subject, as long as there is no identification, you do not need an IRB. In fact, when you go to the hospital, actually most of the pathology labs, you know, send the discarded, you know, samples, you know, actually for research. You know, if you're a cancer sort of specialist, probably you're getting most of your samples from the pathology lab, who's run a sample analysis. As long as your original consent for the patient to do the surgery says that, you know, we may take some of your discarded samples, but as long as you don't have identifiable, you know, the name, you can say this is a female, 45 years old, you know, with type 2 diabetes who also has breast cancer, you know, it's XYZ, then you're okay, but no name. Now, there are a couple of exemptions to that, and those are what are called the orphan or very rare diseases that are so rare, you know, that if you can identify, then it's more likely that everyone will know, because there's only like a dozen guests.
Would you consider interaction as a linguistic observation?
Sorry?
Would you consider interaction as a linguistic observation?
No. If you're sitting in the street and just observing, no. As long as you don't take pictures. You know, because once you take a picture, this is actually, we had this question, very similar to question, from someone, one of our graduate students, who was very interested in kind of understanding sort of some of the dealings, you know, how does a drug deal go? And, you know, what are the sort of people walking the street? Are there special signals that you give to someone that I'm a drug seller or I want drug, and how do they do these transactions? And his thing was that he was going to be absolutely, you know, sort of just observe. He was not going to ask anyone, because we had a lot of concerns about his safety, actually, rather than. Then he came back and he said, what if I start videotaping? And that changed the equation, because now you're taking images which are identifiable. Up to that point, you know, so. Again, here is the interaction. You know, sort of what do we mean by interaction? It means include communication or interpersonal contact between investigator and the subject. So surveys, you know, online surveys, etc. Anything that you actually have some back and forth with the subject is considered as interaction. And private information includes about behavior in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect no observation or recording is taking place. Okay, so if you go into the street, by the way, I don't know about Colombia, but in the US, generally speaking, public spaces, streets, parks, and so on, are not considered, you have no right to privacy, basically. So if you're walking in the street and doing something and somebody videotapes you and sends it to your employer and says, Ara was supposed to be teaching at this hour, and look at him, he's wandering around the streets doing shopping, I can't sue the person, I can't go. Because once you are in a public place, essentially you have no privacy. And this has actually been gone through court systems in a number of instances where somebody had videotaped an event or somebody doing something in public. They went to the court, sued the person. Ultimately, the courts have ruled that public space, you have no privacy. What is not human subject? So in general, biographies, if you are interviewing someone to publish a book or a biography, we don't consider it as a human subject. You don't need an IRB approval. Oral history, we don't consider them if it's only to record the history of the group and not to talk to the individual about their life. So if it's a sort of more of really, you're going out into a tribe or into a group and saying, so tell me what happened during the earthquake of 1988. What was life like? What did you do? Where were you? That sort of oral history, so that doesn't require. Service or course evaluation. So, if you're evaluating a course, we don't need an IRB approval. Services, courses, or concept which is not the intention to share results beyond the university community. That, by the way, is where, for example, if the Office of the Vice Provost is doing a survey of finding out what the faculty think about data support. That doesn't, even though they're directly getting information from each one of you faculty, it's not a human subject, so it doesn't require that. Classroom exercises don't require it, and as I said earlier, research that only use unidentifiable data. And I think most of you know that in the US we refer to them as IRB or Institutional Review Board. In Europe, Canada, they refer to the Ethics Committee. A number of countries actually refer to them as Human Ethics Committee to distinguish it from Animal Ethics Committees, because they refer to animal committees as ethics as well. And I think the key thing to remember is that this language is an IRB is obligated to be an advocate for the actual and potential research subjects. So this is very important, that the role of the IRB is not to advocate the researchers, or their job is to protect the subject. They are sort of the designated agents on behalf of the subject to protect the subjects.
I know that in some cases it's really hard to separate the research methodology and the ethical concerns.
Sure.
But would you say that the main scope of the IRBs is the ethical part of the research?
Yes. Generally speaking, the role of the IRB is not to do scientific review. The IRB is not a scientific merit review. However, if the IRB sees a study which has no scientific value, but is putting people on a lot of risk, or scientifically it makes no sense, or you look at it and you say, I don't even think if it's going to work, then it's okay to, it's appropriate for the committee to raise that, because there is a risk that is being increased at that point for the participation of the subject. That scientific, it's not based on the science. So, but in general, no, they are not scientific review boards, but they can actually look at the science and sort of compare it with the risk and determine that the risk is understated, because scientifically that doesn't have any foundation. Good. I'm going to pass through a couple of these quickly so that we can get into the more important points. Okay. So this is actually kind of more for the researchers, and sort of this part of what the IRB sort of education is for the researchers, is that, you know, sort of absolutely to be responsible, it is the responsibility of the investigator to go to the IRB and get the approval before they start the research. You know, if you start the research and then you afterthought, or you go to publish in a journal and it comes back and says, did you have an ethics review, and you go to the committee, that's a little bit too late. In fact, most IRBs will actually not allow you to use the data. Majority of the IRBs, if you go to them and start the application process, they will ask you if you have already started, and if the answer is yes, they will tell you that none of that data can be used, because that data was not obtained, you know, ethically or legally. Obtain informed consent form as required by the IRB, you know, obtain IRB approval before implementing changes. And again, this is very important, that if something happens to your research project and you're going to make some modifications and changes, you have to go back to the IRB, get the approval before you make the changes. So, you know, essentially don't do anything if the IRB hasn't approved. I think that's the easiest way to say. You know, we use this, actually this slide is a very good sort of answering part of your question, the last bullet point. Make a realistic examination of the probability and magnitude of the risk and benefits. One of the things that most people talk about is worst case scenario. And if I can preach one thing here, is please get away from using that term. Because worst case scenario has absolutely no meaning. Because anything I say as a worst, you can make it a little bit worse. And then the next person can make it even worse. The question is two things. What is the maximum credible? What can happen? You know, can a meteorite fall, hit me, you know, right now as I'm standing here? Yes. What is the likelihood of that happening? You know, is that the worst case scenario? Is the worst case scenario is that the tire will fall on my head? There is a more likelihood of that happening. So a credible accident is something that you know, or event is something that you know will happen. Your car, if you're a driver, at some point, cars, brakes, stop. You know, something happens and there's a failure in the brake system. That's a credible accident to ask for. Incredible accident, it means that the accident happens or the event happens, the backup doesn't work and the humans do the wrong thing. If you start thinking about quantifying or looking at the risk from that rather than what's the worst case that can happen, then it becomes much more realistic when you're examining it. Because then you can, and I think Mercedes here to talk about data privacy and so on, which is something we always worry about. But if you're using a reasonable approach of this, then you can actually take all of your safeguards in place and determine what is the risk associated with it. So that's kind of what I would say if you use that.
Well, I fully agree. I just feel sometimes a little bit related to the comment that someone made yesterday, that we are always, I'm here now 5 years in Europe, after the rest of my life in Holland. Since there is this prejudice against that all we do here is less good on the global, we become so strict that literally it's not allowed to look at who washes their hands in the bathroom without even noticing who it is. It's forbidden by the medical ethics code. And I think, first of all, medical ethics committee members should spend their time on projects that really need to be evaluated for the ethical component, and we should also facilitate research and not make it more difficult. I think it's very important to have medical ethics. Not at all taking away importance there, but I think we sometimes go too far in trying to be perfect and not being criticized by others from outside that we are too light in the medical ethics. But I've not seen a country where it's so strict as here.
I'll take back to my it's the faculty who complained about us. Remember that for a second. That's
But give you a point, which is that
No, I mean, yeah. But,
No, I mean, there has to be the word balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
yeah, I mean, the only time I have to admit that we are a little bit more strict than we should be is when we really think that the research which is going to be done, the outcome has reputational, potential for reputational damage. In those cases, you know, and again, we see this, for example, if you're going to do a study in Africa, as an example, and we scrutinize a little bit more because we want to make sure that you are really following the requirements, because again, we don't want to be accused that our faculty or our researcher, whether it's Harvard researcher or a US researcher, went to Africa and exploited the local. Those we do a little bit of more screening, but it's sort of to make sure that the investigator understands those components and that they're actually following the requirements as it is. But other than that, as I said, we use the criteria of is it credible, what can happen, and if it happens, then what?
Another example would be if a private firm is funding the research and perhaps there is some intention to provide funds to the answer and not to the question.
Yeah, but again, I mean, for us, because we don't care about the source of funding, IRB uses the same standard regardless of who's funding it. And, you know, we ask the investigator the same questions, we do the same evaluation, it doesn't matter what it is. So we don't, that's kind of less deeply for us. Quickly, just very quickly on the informed consent, what I want to actually really highlight is the term informed consent. It's an informed voluntary consent. Informed means that the person has to understand. So do not write it in a kind of scientific jargon that you need 2 PhDs to understand. You know, we have a lot of templates that we have provided, you know, so that actually is very common in the US. Standard templates that if this is, you're doing a basic survey, here is a template language, just pick it up, make it changes to make your research and give it to them. And you know, make sure that it's written, as I said, in the language. Typically, we say it's at about the 8th or 9th grade high school language that people can read. Make it short. If you need to give a lot of attachments, that's fine. You can give them additional information to read, but the consent itself has to be short. If you have a 65-page consent form, you know, by the time you read this to the patient or the patient reads it, they're done. You know, it's just, they have no idea. It's not really informed consent. Informed consent has to be in writing, unless the IRB or the ethics committee is actually giving you a waiver. And we do provide a lot of waivers that you don't have to sign. You know, you don't need to get. And part of it is because sometimes, you know, in some cultures, it's, you know, people are very nervous about signing. I have a colleague of mine in Pakistan that, you know, he's actually the head of the General Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences. So he always says the last time, you know, when I asked him about consent forms and sign, he said the last time I signed a form, they took my goats away. You know, so as far as he's concerned, you know, there's no, so they have a criteria that there is no consent, but verbal. You know, there's an oral consent that you ask and then you document that you ask the question. So there are circumstances, you know, there are people who can't read or write or other impairments, you know. So again, the IRB can give you a waiver, but unless you have that specifically asked and approved by the IRB, there has to be a written consent. One thing that, so this second bullet point on this one is, I would like to highlight is that if you are the one who's actually doing the consent, I would always advise the faculty that once they have done the consent, ask them for questions. Do you have any questions? Did you understand? Do you understand your alternatives? Do you know what, if you can do? Sort of highlight the four or five questions to make sure that the subject actually understood what you just tell them. Because sometimes they're nervous, sometimes they're concerned. And this is sort of more of an issue actually in the clinical setting, where the subject already has an anxiety and they sometimes are worried that if they say no, they may not participate in this study. So they want to sort of just go yes, yes, yes. So just double check things. And again, one thing again is that once your consent form has been approved by the IRB, that's it. If you want to make any changes, you have to go to the IRB. You cannot make any changes. The changing without the IRB approval, even if it's just changing a name, a contact name, it's actually not acceptable. It has to be approved by the IRB. And again, this is sort of when circumstances which you can actually get an exception. I'm not going to go through the content, but we can provide samples of this. It will be part of this, where you can see we give them sort of examples of what the standard content should be. So that way it's easier for the researchers to follow the template. Yeah, so, but I think Mercedes is going to talk a little bit about protecting the research data, because in most instances, really the most sort of potential risk is that of the private data. Do you have this one or? Oh, it's here. Yeah.
So Ara has been talking more about, up to now, about when you're starting your research and all the everything you need to go through before you start the study. But at some point you're going to finish that study, and in many cases it will be important to share your data with others, to make it available publicly in some cases, or in some restricted form. And this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, because some of the funding agencies or the foundations will require you to do so, to make that data accessible. Also because some journals will require you to make the data accessible when you go and publish the results. And in addition to being compliant with funding agencies and journals, you also want to do that so that you enable others to reuse your data and be able to continue, extend the research that you've done by using different type of analysis, or just enable others to reproduce your results and have more credibility on the research that you've done, because somebody else can verify it independently of yourself. So I already mentioned that to some people here, but one of the my standards would be that research data should be as open as possible, but as restricted as needed. So when we talk about sensitive data, when we're working research with human subjects, it's important to focus on the restricted as needed, right? Just very recently, in the last month or so, this paper if you look at the Advancing Methods in Practice in Psychology Science, published this paper on practical tips for ethical data sharing by Michelle Mayer. I recommend to go through the paper, but here's some of the highlights of the paper. So she recommends, don't promise to destroy your data. So there have been, in some disciplines, a practice of when you finish your research, you're going to destroy your data. It was even what you agreed on in the beginning of your research, in some cases in anthropology, in some cases in sociology. But then you don't have a record of what you've done, really. It's very hard for others to verify it, even for yourself to understand what you did some time afterwards. So think of how to store your data, analyze it, and share it in a responsible way, but not destroy it. The other thing is that don't promise not to share your data and say, I will never share my data from the beginning, right? I might contradict some of the things that IRB would suggest you to do, but I think that's part of that balance, right? We need to find the right balance. There is a tension between, I want to make my research should be as transparent as possible and as verifiable as possible. At the same time, we need to take precautions for when data are restricted or have sensitive information. So the other suggestion is a recommendation here from this paper is do get consent to retain and share data. So at the point at the beginning of your research, try to get consent for that. And again, in a responsible way, right? And do incorporate data retention and sharing clauses into IRB template. It's not something we've done completely, but it's something that we'll need to think about. How do we do that so that those data sets can be shared at the end of the investigation? And then at the same time, that's why some of those things are contradictory. We say, do be thoughtful when considering risk of identification. So when you're going to share your data, it's going to be de-identified. But the question is it always sufficiently de-identified, right? So Latanya Sweeney, who's a professor in the government department at Harvard, but also a computer scientist, and with whom I work much of the time in collaborations, showed in a paper in 2000 that 87% of the US citizens could be identified when you only had a zip code, right? The zip code is where they live, the birth date, and the sex, so male or female. So this is a very large percentage of people that just with those three variables that usually you would use in many studies, even without removing the name and other identification information, you still would keep, you could re-identify. So this is when we're saying be responsible in terms of what if you're going to share your data and it's identified, make sure that it cannot be re-identified with additional information that now more increasingly we have public, right? And but on the other hand, you can do it easily by just instead of using the entire zip code, just use the first 3 digits. You still, in terms of reanalysis or in terms of getting information about your study, you still have a lot of information about the location, right? If you say the year of birth instead of the actual birth date, you also remove, well, with doing these 2 things, you now have only 0.04% of individuals that can be identified. So sometimes it just requires to know how do you need to identify your data set. We, in the Institute, there are quantitative social science, and this morning I was talking about, we provide sometimes advice about how you're going to identify data. The researcher comes to them and says, I have this data set and I need to make it available to others, but I need to make sure it's identifiable. Of course, HIPAA has the 18 variables. I don't know if you're familiar with HIPAA, the regulator health information.
That's the patient data. You know, when you have patient data, it's uncovered in the US under what is called the HIPAA, which is the Healthcare Insurance and Privacy Act. And under the HIPAA, there are 18 specific elements that if you remove that from the patient data, that becomes the identified, that becomes very difficult to be identified.
Right. But even that is being reviewed, in part because Latanya keeps re-identifying data sets. I mean, that's the only thing that some of the researchers that work on data privacy, they make all the efforts to re-identify data sets. So it's not clear that everybody would be able to do that. But
well, I think part of the problem, and I think this is important, especially for the IRBs and so on to consider, is that what was public information is changing every day. You know, as Google and Facebook and Twitter and all the other things that you do, that information is being stored and it's becoming publicly available. Every time you go buy something from Amazon or online purchasing, there's a record of it. Every time you do a search on your computer for a jacket, I mean, if you don't believe me, go do this, try this. Open up a website and start looking for a particular make and model from a particular company. And then 3 weeks later, log into your computer and you will see that there is an ad which appears from that company for that particular jacket which happens to be on sale. And that is why identification is becoming, or re-identification is becoming more difficult.
Right. I mean, some scholars would say that you can never completely identify your data, right? But that's why, again, finding a balance is important. Actually, because
Europe is moving away from the terminology of
anonymized.
From the identified to anonymized, because it's a better term, it's a more realistic term. That at this point you're anonymous, but you don't promise that you can't be identified, it might be.
Yeah, although at the end, it's just terminology, so you need to figure out what is the right thing to do, but it's true that that's become an issue that is more relevant more recently.
This is actually very interesting because usually what we do in informed consent forms is we basically write your data will be confidential, anonymous, and I think a rewording might be needed in that you probably have to say every effort will be made.
Yes.
Right, exactly,
That's
exactly.
exactly.
And we have that in terms of use, sometimes
That's
the
what we
effort
do.
is made,
Yeah.
and also if you're gonna use the data, you're not gonna try to re-identify it. So, I mean, if you're gonna share the data with coworkers, so others are not gonna try to re-identify it. Here's another example also from Latania's team, Latania Sweeney's team, that in this case, just because more and more of this data is available, right, from news, from you can purchase the state health database. Yeah, so they combine some information that you would have about accidents and so it's hospital data, and identify a data set that supposedly was anonymous, but just combining all this information, public information, together with news and the database, you could identify, in this case, 43%.
Actually, this was the government. They identified the governor of the state.
Yes.
The person who was the one, just using the public and the news and the newspaper information, ambulance trips, what the schedule of the governor, which is public information. So they're just combining all of that information. They identified that he's the one who was in an accident and actually was taken to the hospital. So I mean, it's really, I mean, he does a lot of, I mean, Natalia does a lot of fun stuff, but it makes me always nervous when she does this thing.
Well, she's gonna find out about you, right?
Yeah, then she wants to publish.
She's meeting with Macron, with the president of France this week.
Okay, so
I don't know what they want to talk. So with Latania and some other computer scientists and myself, we thought about how you could still responsibly share the data set that has sensitive information, but in a way that you're following the requirements that are needed based on your sensitivity. So this project that it's called Data Tags tries to address this issue, and there is a paper that here there is the but you could go and read, but it basically defines what a data tag means and how it can be used when you're sharing data sets. So a data tag is a machine-readable policy. Machine-readable meaning that it's a metadata file, like a JSON file, an XML file, if you're familiar with those formats, that other computers, some computer system will be able to read, right, and make sense of it with following a standard that defines the security features, the requirements on security, and requirements on access for that data set. And so each data, that means that each data set, when you're going to share a data set, will have a data tag associated with it. And here, so here's a high-level definition of those data tags. It goes from blue to green to yellow to orange to red, crimson.
crimson is Harvard's color.
Exactly. We always
We have to have our color.
This is
yes.
if you have data sensitive as crimson,
So
problem,
actually right now IRB uses a numbering system for ease of this.
I'm
Level
gonna
1, 2, 3,
show
4.
this
Yeah,
one.
okay,
So,
there it is.
yeah. So yeah, because Harvard, I mean, in a way that we define these data tags in part inspired with something that the security officer, the IT security officer at Harvard did. They defined these security levels, which is, I mean, I don't know. Actually, I haven't discussed with the CIO here if there is something similar, but a number of universities have defined sometimes 3 levels, sometimes 2 levels. And so we went with these different 5 levels to see, based on the sensitivity and the risk of accessing that data, what requirements should be satisfied when you're storing that data, right? So that in some cases it means, well, an encrypted, the storage can encrypted, sometimes only the transmission of the data needs to be encrypted, but sometimes you need actually to just work on it in a a room that has a computer and it's outside the network in the very high, for very high confidential information.
So can I
So,
just add to
yes,
this?
yeah.
Because IRB, our IRB actually determines the risk level, or assigns, I should say, a risk level to every project, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And however, we have someone from the IT risk management, someone from the IT security who's a member of the IRB, sits on the IRB, and then he or she, depending which, because we have, either what it's Joseph or
Yes,
the
yes.
counterparts.
Yes.
They sit on the committee, they review this, and then they determine the level of security, then they work with the investigators to make sure whatever the data is being stored has that kind of level of data security. Yes.
US IRB, if it drives to researchers who think about, because I think most researchers traditionally we don't think about
Right.
Yes.
data sharing. Do you actively suggest why don't you consider not putting this thing on, not sharing data in your informed consent, so that in the future?
Yeah, we do.
share?
We do actually. In fact, we highly recommend that. We actually send back, because if you look at our IRB application, which is online, we have a section, for example, on the data, and who will you share, and who will you do, and we actually try to go back to the faculty and what we call absolute statements we eliminate. We suggest that they do not put absolute statements. Also, we suggest that in the consent form, they try to actually put a statement about the future use of the data, because sometimes they say the data will be destroyed at the end of this study. And you're going to tell them, look, you may have other reasons why you want to keep the data too. So yeah, we do advise that. And actually, we also one of the reasons we ended up actually asking the IT security persons to be part of the committee or sit as a member of the committee is because what we found out is that they can work with the faculty by slight modification of data elements that they're collecting to move it into a lower, sort of level, without impacting the research. That's something that IRB doesn't have the expertise. So yeah, but we do actually very strongly advise that they don't use absolute.
That's useful, for example, for a student data, many times just the year of birth is sufficient, right? The data, so the age or so,
Yes.
and that changes completely the identification or the level of, and the level of security you are required. So with the data tax project, in a way, we're trying, it is a relatively new project, and we're establishing and working with collaborators in Europe, and so to establish it in other countries. But the idea is to have an international standard for sharing sensitive data, if we can ever get there, right? But it facilitates then when you talk about, well, I need this data set and it has all these requirements. It's just you have a common language on how you're going to share that data set from one institution to another. Because those levels apply to Harvard, but maybe another institution will have another set of levels. Besides, it also addresses how to access the data, not only how you're going to store it and what type of storage it will be, but also the access conditions. So when you go into, for Blue, you just can download the data. It's open data, basically. There is no human subject information. For Green, you might have a data set that is identified, but you still want to be able to ask for, if somebody else is going to use it, you want that person to register or to give you the information. So if by any chance that data set becomes re-identified, you know who has used it and has a record of that. Then yellow, you might have some level of sensitivity that it's not very harmful, but still you want to be able to have the data under a password, a protected password, right? And you need to request it to access it. With orange and red and crimson and with a use agreement that would actually, the user needs to sign, agree with that will follow those conditions, those terms, before they can use the data. So this is the part about data sharing, and I think that now we have.
Perfect. Yeah, so
the
thank you
final
for
summary
saying.
and this.
And again, for us, with very few exceptions on the ones which have a clinical component to it. Really, the data security and data privacy tends to be the most of the protocols. That's the higher risk. It's how you keep. Again, if you are getting a lot of, sort of if you're an economist and he's getting sort of data from people's spending habits, phone data, records, etc., we're more interested in the data security. What I would like to do is sort of very quickly get your opinions and get you involved. So we have a researcher who plans to conduct a secondary data analysis. He or she is using existing government records, so they are records that the government gives. They have an early childhood longitudinal study, for example, from kindergarten, starting from 1998, all the way to 8th grade. They want to look at 18,200 students, and they want to do an analysis to describe how the summer learning students who go to summer school, do they do better job in learning or not? And then, so the part of this would be that the summer activities in the data set include variables hypothesized to relate to summer learning, such as school, camp attendance, math, activities, etc. They would use a regression analysis and other statistical techniques to estimate when a group in the summer learning, do better or not versus the ones in the cohort 1 and 2, those going to summer school and those not going to summer school. And all the analyses are in an aggregate level. I mean, they're getting the data and they're analyzing it. You need an IRB. You said something. No? Why? Yeah, why? That's it. That's aggregate data. No, that's exactly what it is. It's not a human subject research because it's still research, but it's not human subject research.
But don't you even look at how, because they are identifiable data because you measure the children repeatedly.
Sure. No, but in this particular case, they're getting the government's existing data in an aggregate form, and they're looking at the record.
So it's public information, or
it's not quite public information because it's actually this particular study. The Department of Education holds this data. You can ask for the data. You can ask them either identify, like the raw data, in which case then that's different because now you have information.
And it's not very complex, but you have to say how you use it.
Exactly. Yeah, but in this particular case, they're getting the aggregate data, and they're only looking at the data. They have no interactions. They don't talk to mates. They're not going to the camps. They're just looking at the data that the government has collected to see whether the summer programs are effective or not. Okay.
Okay, but in terms of the procedure,
Yes.
researchers are going to present this to the IRB.
Yes,
and then
they
the
present
IRB
this to
will-
the IRB, yes. And again, one of the things that we do as part of our training, we do provide quite a lot of examples of what is not human subject research, so the faculty can start thinking about this, and actually they can go online and ask for a not human subject determination. And there's a slightly shorter form that they fill. I mean, they can complete the full form and somebody will get back to them and say, this is not human subject. But most of the time, because we have done the training and we've given them a lot of examples of what is not human subjects, they complete, it's just under 2 pages, name, rank, serial number, and a brief description, and then based on that, then we go back to that and make the determination.
But all need to have either the letter, this is not
Absolutely.
human subject,
Yes.
so that you, the IRB,
Yes.
determines if it is or not.
Yes. We are working on what is called an IRB wizard. It is in the phase 2 of testing that we have shared with the Office of Human Resource Protection, the government, for their approval. We have run phase 1 with quite a lot of studies in which the faculty in 14 participating universities
submitted their application through the wizard and to the IRB, and we did a comparison of the outcomes. We're fine-tuned it. We are actually probably starting 1st of April, we'll start phase 2, and we hope to do at least another 25,000 studies nationally. But the purpose of the wizard is that when it's done, the logic behind it is such that the faculty can go and answer the questions. And at some point it kicks them, either gets the non-human subject, actually will also do the exempt termination. And then or at some point it says stop, submit the application to the IRB. So we're trying to streamline that as well. Yes?
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Sure.
It's not totally related to
Sure.
what you're talking about. So, I was wondering if you said that the IRB represents the interest of the future subjects of the research. I was wondering if you in some cases also represent the interest of the subjects that are not part of the studies. And thinking about, there are concerns about the composition of the samples, and that they are not, sometimes there are some groups, for example, gender or ethnic groups that are not represented in the samples being used by the scientists. So, do you have any procedure where you check if the samples are? Do you have any? Do you have any reasoning about the composition of the samples to have samples that are more representative of the whole population? Because we know that many of the research is conducted with, I don't know, probably in America you have this concern with ethnic groups, with white groups, or samples that have young people or young adults, and don't include people that are older, for example.
That's actually a very, very good question. So the IRB, in determining or reviewing the application to approve, there are two things that you have to define or describe. One is the inclusion criteria, the justification, the description of who is being included. And then the second question is are there groups which are being excluded? And if so, why? Then you have to define that. And then the IRB will make the determination whether both the inclusion and or exclusion criteria is acceptable. And that's the kind of things that they would kind of go out and. Now, again, this is where reasonableness and having, so that it becomes effective, So if they're doing a study of women of childbearing and looking at the effect of hormonal changes as a estrogen, then it's a very different, you obviously don't do a lot of questioning as to why are you excluding, women who are over 60 or men and so on. But they have to define, who's included and who's not. That includes children, that includes specific minority groups if they're excluding, and then justify why not. All right, quickly, another one. This is the conditions, okay? So they have submitted for the approval, the study is approved, all subjects will be given a written consent. The subjects must be told that they can withdraw from the study anytime. Now you have patients, that is an interesting case for this study. So there's so the patient comes in, participates in this study, and it's really a very interesting case, and starts kind of the participation 5 weeks into a 6-week study. So this is 6 weeks, you're asking the patient to come in every week for a blood sample and an X-ray, okay?
Is there a possibility to receive some money in the beginning of the term, or
No,
usually?
they get sometimes money. You never get money in the beginning of the experiment. Sometimes you get money at each session. Often it's your expenses. And by the way, one of the other things that the IRB looks at the payment to the subject and the reasonableness of the patients, the amount that you're paying. to make that there is no coercion or incentive. So you can't say come in for a half an hour interview and we'll give you $10,000. You know, I mean, at best we give them is a Starbucks coffee certificate. But seriously, it is an important factor. But in this case, the patient has sort of done 5 weeks, and then at the end of 5 weeks, he tells you that you no longer want to participate. Okay? Questions? What would you do? Okay.
And depending if you have identified something about it in the protocol said,
Yeah.
you can use the previous data or not, it depends
Yeah.
what you can bring with the data.
So that's part of the thing that you're absolutely right. You know, you should ideally, I mean, in a case like this, you should ask the subject why they're dropping out of the study, because you want to understand the reasoning. And sometimes it might be just this is inconvenience. It's very difficult for them to get a bus, even a train, and to get there. But if the subject is not willing to participate, and it basically says, look, in order to participate in this study, I have to take a day off from work, and I use $120 a day, you know, for my salary. Can you offer them $120 to come in and participate for the last week?
Because the participation is just like condition.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Oh, I think you were. Yeah, absolutely correct. You know, you know, actually the IRB would really have serious problem if they found out that you offered them money to participate in the study. Oops, I think I'm pushing the wrong button. So really the only option you have is to talk to the patient and try to explain to the subject, you know, that this is a very interesting case, we would like to have you participate, and so on. And if the subject still says, no, I don't want to do this anymore, that's the end of it. And then if you have not, asked them previously if you can use the data, you could possibly ask them if it's okay to use the rest of the data. But then, you know, a lot of the time it's a question of, you know, is that data going to be valuable if you need it to have 6 elements? And again, that becomes a professional judgment that you have to take. All right, I think we've run out of time.
Correctly,
Yeah, sure.
but it seems to be that a collective contract is okay. Like, for example, if the investigator says, I'm going to pay $1,000 for all the participants in this experiment, that seems to be reasonable fine. But you can use it for an individual contract with these interesting patients.
Yeah. And again, for example, we, you know, in a lot of the surveys, you know, a lot of the social sciences surveys, psychology studies, if you look at it, typically it's between half an hour, an hour and a half, or whatever it is. And you would notice that they are paying anything between $10 or $15. And usually it's a gift certificate that you can go buy coffee or something. That's reasonable, and you say, okay, you know, so but it's not an inducement. If you were offering $200, then the IRB would have some questions, because with the $200 for a half an hour interview, every student is going to come in. So it's, you know, medical studies, depending on how much there is, typically it's between 500 and 2,500 tops, if they pay any. I mean, a lot of the times, most of the payment is actually to cover your out-of-pocket expenses, you know, your travel expenses, your cab, parking, you know. But you have to tell the IRB how much you are paying total, and in what shape. Other questions, comments? Otherwise, I think we've gone over a little bit of time. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.